Every primary scene heading needs to communicate the camera placement, location, and time of day for the scene. Interior, warehouse, day. And some include shot and subject information. Medium close-up on Mr. Blonde. But occasionally you'll want to indicate something that doesn't quite fit into these neat categories. And that's where heading notes come in. And if you've watched the previous videos in this series, then you've actually already learned how to write a heading note. Interior, L Street Bar and Grill, night. When we had an interior scene and wanted to communicate a broader geographical location, we could wrap it in parentheses and stick it at the end of the location element. The geographic location, like a city, isn't actually part of the interior, but if we still want to make sure our reader knows where we are, we can include it as a note. There aren't many precise rules for heading notes, but you'll usually see them either on their own line like a mini slug, begin flashback, exterior, Philadelphia Street, night, or added to the front or end of the heading rather than slipped into the middle like our location example. When included in a larger heading, they're usually set off by a dash, parentheses, or brackets, with brackets being my personal preference because they're often used for notes in the description as well, and consistency improves readability. The most common scene notes you'll see mark flashbacks, exterior, Tesla's laboratory, night, flashback, dreams, exterior, Dachau, night, Teddy's dream, and visions. Interior, convenience store, night, live vision. The difference between a dream and a vision being that dreams are from the character's perspective and require them to be sleeping or zoning out, while visions don't always involve the character that's seeing them and are usually triggered by some event. But there are also dreams that contain visions of the future, so don't waste your time stressing over the nomenclature, especially since flashbacks, dreams, and visions are all handled similarly, which is why I'll just refer to a flashback from here on. If a flashback lasts for a single full scene, the easiest way to handle it is to simply add flashback as a note on the end of the scene heading. Interior, science lab, day, flashback. You'll also rarely see writers italicize their entire flashback to set it apart from scenes in the present. If a flashback spans multiple scenes, you can either repeat this note in every scene heading for the flashback sequence, exterior, empty street, night, flashback. Or you can add a note like flashback or begin flashback as a mini slug before the first scene, and something like end flashback, back to scene, or back to present when it's over. Some writers also like to add a colon to the opening slug to make it a bit clearer that the note applies to multiple scenes. But keep in mind that you don't have to indicate flashbacks, dreams, or visions at all. If it's obvious from context or you don't want the reader or audience to realize your scene is one of these, then don't include the note. Right on Ripley, screaming, snapping up into frame, alone in the darkened hospital room. She gasps for breath, clutching pathetically at her chest. There's no demented horror ripping itself out of her. Just make sure withholding that information creates intrigue rather than just confusion. Notes indicating flashbacks, visions, and dreams are often necessary for a reader to immediately make sense of a story. Directors usually end up indicating these sequences to the audience through on-screen cues like filters and transitions, or through sound cues. But describing those on the page often feels awkward or inorganic, so a note is usually the least intrusive approach. Some writers extend this idea to things like the weather. Exterior, Albert's houseboat, day, raining. They include a quick note that it's raining in a scene rather than specifying the weather in the description, or add a moving or driving note to a scene that takes place in a moving vehicle where the setting outside the car isn't important. Interior, cab, moving, night. These notes might be quicker than including the information in the narrative description, but in my opinion, they miss the point of a note. It's a maxim of screenwriting that we write for the screen, not the page, but notes are the exception. They're meant for the reader rather than the final audience. Adding a flashback note makes for a more natural read than some vague description of a soft focus shot to imply a flashback. And if the reader doesn't even pick up on the implication, then things can really go off the rails. Implying a flashback just doesn't pass the campfire test. If you sat around a campfire telling a story, you would point out when someone flashes back to a memory, not just tell your listeners to imagine a hazy scene. And on the other end, you wouldn't say, in this next bit, it'll be raining. You just describe the weather and the natural flow of the story. Exterior, Albert's houseboat, day. They open the door and venture into the downpour in their garbage bag parkas. Or just describe a moving car, not give a preamble. Interior, cab, night. As the car moves through the city, Butch gets one of his boxing gloves off. In cases like this, adding a note takes the reader out of the story, while putting the information in the description keeps them immersed in your world. Which all brings us to another rare use case, timeline notes. In scripts where the timeline can get confusing, you'll sometimes see a timeline note with the exact date, year, or day in the story. Interior, Hopper's cabin, 3 months ago, night. If we apply our campfire test, it's pretty easy to think of stories that use this framework. Even the Bible starts with a story broken into 7 days. But remember that a note is only for the reader, which means a timeline note should only be used to help the reader keep track of things. And honestly, it's pretty hard to imagine a scenario where the reader would be confused without the timeline note, but the audience wouldn't be. It could happen, and if it does to you, then a heading note might be the perfect solution. But if you need the audience to know too, you'll need to show it in the description, naturally drop it into the dialogue, or superimpose the info on screen. Chiron, 3 months later. Something we'll get into later in this series. If you've watched these last few videos, then by this point, you know how to write primary and secondary scene headings for any single location. But sometimes you need your story to unfold in 2 places at once, which is why you should check out this video to learn how to intercut and format split screen sequences to master phone calls, expectations versus reality, and parallel sequences.